A child vanishing without a trace is every parent's worst nightmare. For over 5 decades, one family lived through this unimaginable horror, clinging to fading hope as the years turned into decades. After 51 long years of questions and heartache, DNA science finally accomplished what countless searches and investigations could not, bringing a missing toddler home at last. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. August 23, 1971, hung over Fort Worth like a heavy blanket. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly, turning the pavement hot enough to fry an egg. Inside their modest apartment, with the window unit humming desperately against the heat, Alta Highsmith was juggling the demands of motherhood and work, preparing for her afternoon shift at the diner. At 23, Alta already carried the weight of responsibility on her slender shoulders. She and her husband Jeffrey Highsmith worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. That morning, Alta had placed an advertisement in the local newspaper for childcare help, a decision that would haunt her for decades to come. The woman who arrived at their door seemed respectable enough. She wore long white gloves and a bonnet that framed her face, giving her an air of old-fashioned propriety. She claimed to be sent by the employment agency, and in their rush to make ends meet, neither Alta nor Jeffrey had time to verify her credentials. Alta showed the woman around their small living space, introduced her to 21-month-old Melissa, and hurried off to work. She seemed so professional, Alta would later tell police through tears. She said she'd take good care of my baby. By evening, the Highsmith household had descended into chaos. The babysitter never returned with Melissa. Jeffrey paced the apartment, his work boots leaving scuff marks on the linoleum floor. When Alta arrived home to find her daughter missing, her scream could be heard by neighbors 3 doors down. The police search began immediately. Officers combed through the neighborhood, knocking on doors and questioning residents. There was no sign of forced entry, no witnesses who had seen the woman leave with the toddler, and no ransom demand. Melissa Highsmith had simply vanished into the sweltering Texas afternoon. "It's like they disappeared into thin air," one officer told the devastated parents. The description of the woman, white gloves, bonnet, professional demeanor, would become etched in Alta's memory, a phantom that would appear in her nightmares for years to come. Within days, the local faith community mobilized. Members of First Baptist Church organized prayer vigils, distributed flyers with Melissa's photo, and created search parties that fanned out across Fort Worth. Neighbors brought casseroles and offered shoulders to cry on. But as summer faded into fall, the trail grew cold. The Highsmith's apartment, once filled with a toddler's laughter and the everyday chaos of family life, fell silent except for Alta's quiet sobbing at night and the persistent ringing of the telephone as Jeffrey called police stations, hospitals, and anyone who might have information about their missing daughter. The Highsmith's modest living room transformed over the years into what neighbors called the waiting room. The walls, once adorned with typical family photos, gradually became a timeline of absence. Alta Highsmith arranged the display with meticulous care. Melissa's only baby picture at 21 months centered among age progression sketches commissioned every 5 years. The phone sat strategically beneath this gallery, yellowed tape securing the images against the persistent Texas humidity that curled their edges. "I know she'll call someday," Alta would tell visitors from First Baptist Church who brought casseroles and prayers. Her faith remained unshakable even as detectives' visits became less frequent. The mother kept her daughter's favorite stuffed rabbit on the sofa, its fabric worn thin from years of hopeful touching. Every Thanksgiving, with clockwork precision, Alta set an extra place at the table. The empty chair became a family tradition, a physical space reserved for their missing piece. "Melissa will be hungry when she comes home," she would say, spooning cranberry sauce onto the untouched plate. Her other children learned not to question this ritual, understanding it was as essential to their mother as breathing. Jeffrey coped differently. Guilt consumed the father, manifesting in an obsessive collection of missing persons cases from across the country. He filled filing cabinets with newspaper clippings, police reports, and theories scrawled on yellow legal pads. The dining room table often disappeared beneath this sea of paper, each case studied for patterns that might lead to his daughter. "Someone knows something," he would mutter, addressing envelopes late into the night. Jeffrey wrote to police departments, journalists, politicians, anyone who might listen. Most letters went unanswered, but he continued writing them, convinced that persistence would eventually yield results. The couple's marriage bent but never broke under the weight of their shared grief. They found different paths through the same pain, Alta through faith, Jeffrey through action. On difficult nights, they would sit silently on their porch swing, watching passing headlights illuminate the street where their toddler should have played. As technology evolved, so did their methods. Jeffrey reluctantly learned to use a computer, scanning old photos and creating digital flyers. Alta joined prayer chains that stretched across Texas, her daughter's name whispered in churches she would never visit. "Time doesn't heal," Alta once told a reporter on the 20th anniversary of the disappearance. "It just gives you more practice at carrying the weight." The family continued their vigil, marking birthdays with small celebrations, wondering if somewhere their daughter was celebrating too, unaware of the family that had never stopped watching for her return. Just a few miles from where the Highsmiths continued their desperate search, Melanie Walden grew up in a small, weathered house in North Fort Worth. The residence stood out with its perpetually drawn lace curtains and an eerie stillness that neighbors often remarked upon. Inside those walls, life followed strict routines established by the woman Melanie knew as her mother. The house rarely welcomed visitors. When the doorbell occasionally rang, her mother would freeze, eyes widening with alarm before ushering Melanie into the back bedroom. "Stay quiet," she would whisper, her voice tight with anxiety. "Don't make a sound until I come get you." These moments became so routine that Melanie stopped questioning them. Outdoor play was similarly restricted. While neighborhood children rode bicycles and played kickball in the street, Melanie watched from behind the curtains, allowed outside only during carefully scheduled moments when few people were around. "The world isn't safe for special girls like you," her mother would explain, applying lavender lotion to Melanie's hands. A scent that would forever remind her of confinement disguised as protection. Education came through yellowed workbooks from the 1970s, their pages filled with outdated information and simplistic exercises. The woman insisted on homeschooling, claiming public schools were filled with dangers and bad influences. "I'm keeping you pure," she would say, though Melanie often wondered what she was being kept from rather than protected against. As she grew older, inconsistencies in her mother's stories began to surface. When Melanie asked about baby pictures, none could be found. Questions about grandparents or extended family were deflected with vague references to estrangements or deaths. Her birth certificate remained mysteriously inaccessible, supposedly lost in a move. "Where did I get my red hair?" Melanie once asked, noticing her mother's dark locks bore no resemblance to her own auburn waves. "From your father," came the terse reply. "And where is he?" The woman would grow distant at such inquiries, her eyes focusing somewhere beyond the walls. "He wasn't good for us," she would say, before changing the subject. The house itself seemed to hold secrets. Certain closets remained locked, and the attic was strictly forbidden. The neighborhood children eventually stopped inviting Melanie to play, and she learned to live within the hushed atmosphere of her home, where whispers replaced laughter and questions went unanswered. At night, Melanie sometimes experienced strange dreams of another house, another woman singing lullabies, fragments that disappeared upon waking, but left her with an inexplicable sense of loss. These moments fed a growing suspicion that something fundamental about her life wasn't right, a feeling that would follow her into adulthood, waiting for the truth to finally break through. The Highsmith siblings grew up in the shadow of absence. Every birthday, Christmas, and family gathering featured that empty chair, a physical reminder of Melissa Highsmith that Alta insisted on maintaining. "She's still part of this family," Alta would say, straightening the place setting no one was allowed to use. As the siblings reached adulthood, they channeled their collective grief into action. Meeting initially in their parents' living room, they eventually formed Texas Families United, a support group for relatives of missing children. St. Andrew's Methodist Church offered them a small meeting room every third Thursday, where families would gather with coffee in styrofoam cups and hearts full of both sorrow and determination. Jeffrey Highsmith rarely missed a meeting. He would arrive early, arranging chairs in a circle, placing boxes of tissues strategically around the room. His obsession with missing persons cases had transformed into expertise. He knew which detectives to call, which forms to file, and how to keep a case from growing cold. Dad turned his guilt into a roadmap for others. His youngest daughter once remarked, "He couldn't bring Melissa home, but he could help other families navigate the nightmare." By the early 2000s, as digital technology revolutionized communication, the siblings recognized a new opportunity. The oldest brother, tech-savvy and persistent, created the Finding Melissa Highsmith Facebook page. Alta provided the only baby photograph they had, Melissa at 21 months, smiling in a sundress, unaware of what lay ahead. The page became their digital beacon. They posted age progression images created by forensic artists, showing how Melissa might look at 30, 40, and 50 years old. Each image garnered hundreds of shares across Fort Worth and beyond, creating a network of amateur sleuths and compassionate strangers. "Every share is someone else looking for her," Alta would say, watching the notification numbers climb on her children's devices. Though she never fully understood social media, she grasped its power to extend their search beyond Texas. The siblings took turns managing the page, responding to tips that ranged from heartfelt to bizarre. Most led nowhere, but they investigated each one. They organized community searches when credible sightings emerged, distributing flyers at shopping centers and gas stations across Tarrant County. Through birthdays, marriages, and the births of their own children, the Highsmith siblings maintained their vigil. They added their DNA to every database that emerged, hoping for a match. They attended conferences on missing persons and cold cases, absorbing new techniques and technologies. "Melissa isn't just missing," her sister told a local reporter on the 40th anniversary of the disappearance. "She's waiting to be found, and we'll never stop looking." In the waning months of 2021, a message appeared in Jeffrey Highsmith's email inbox that would change everything. Lisa Jo Sheely, a genealogy enthusiast with a passion for cold cases, had been following the Highsmith family's decades-long search. After reading about their story on the Finding Melissa Highsmith Facebook page, she felt compelled to reach out. "Mr. Highsmith," her message began, "I believe DNA technology might help find your daughter." Jeffrey stared at the screen, the familiar mix of hope and skepticism washing over him. After 50 years of false leads and disappointments, he had learned to guard his heart. Yet something about Lisa Jo's methodical explanation of genetic genealogy sparked his interest. During their first phone call, Lisa Jo explained how ancestry databases were revolutionizing missing persons cases across America. Her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who understood both the science and the delicate emotions involved. "These DNA tests can identify relatives you never knew existed," she told Jeffrey. "Even distant cousins can create a map that might lead us to Melissa." Alta joined the call, clutching her husband's hand. The couple exchanged glances across their living room, the same room where Melissa's photos had hung for half a century. "We've tried everything else," Alta whispered, her faith never wavering despite decades of heartbreak. After consulting with their other children, the Highsmiths agreed to Lisa Jo's suggestion. A week later, a small package arrived at their Fort Worth home, a DNA collection kit with simple instructions. Jeffrey sat at the kitchen table, examining the plastic tube and swab. His hands trembled slightly as he followed the directions, the magnitude of this moment weighing heavily on his shoulders. This small sample contained the genetic code that connected him to his long-lost daughter, if she was still out there. "You're doing great," Alta encouraged, watching as he sealed the envelope. Before heading to the post office, Jeffrey paused by the mantel where Melissa's baby picture stood alongside age progression sketches. He touched the frame gently, a ritual he had performed thousands of times. "Maybe this time," he murmured. The wait proved excruciating. Each day, Jeffrey checked his email obsessively, sometimes waking in the middle of the night to see if results had arrived. Lisa Jo called weekly, tempering their expectations while maintaining a thread of optimism. "These things take time," she reminded them. "The database needs to find matches, and then we need to interpret what those matches mean." As Thanksgiving approached, the holiday when Alta always set an extra plate for their missing daughter, the Highsmiths tried not to count the days. After 50 years of waiting, what were a few more weeks? Yet in their hearts they sensed something different about this attempt. A whisper of possibility that neither dared name aloud. Jeffrey Highsmith's hands trembled as he opened the email from the DNA testing company. After 51 years of searching, hoping, and praying, he hardly dared to believe that this moment could bring answers. He called Alta immediately, and they huddled together at the kitchen table, staring at the screen. "I don't understand," Alta whispered, squinting at the results. "This says we have a 100% match. But not to Melissa?" Lisa Jo Sheely leaned forward, her genealogy expertise suddenly invaluable. "These are matches to 3 adults who share your DNA profile in a very specific way," she explained, pointing to the screen. "They're not siblings or cousins, they're your grandchildren." The room fell silent as the implications settled over them. Their missing daughter hadn't just survived. She had grown up, lived a life, and had 3 children of her own. "She's alive," Jeffrey said, his voice breaking. "Our baby is out there somewhere." Lisa Jo's mind was already racing through possibilities. "This changes our entire approach," the genealogist said, pulling out her notebook. "Instead of looking for Melissa directly, we can work backward through her children." Over the next 72 hours, Lisa barely slept. She cross-referenced public records, social media profiles, and electoral rolls. The DNA matches had usernames that provided clues. One mentioned Fort Worth in their profile, keeping them tantalizingly close to where Melissa had disappeared. "It's like she never left Texas," Alta remarked, hope and heartbreak mingling in her voice. By the 3rd day, Lisa had compiled a list of potential matches. Using marriage records and property databases, she narrowed her search to a woman named Melanie Walden, whose 3 children matched the DNA profiles exactly. "Look at this," Lisa said, showing the Highsmiths a social media photo she'd found. The woman in the image had Alta's smile and Jeffrey's distinctive eyebrows. Though now in her 50s, something about her expression echoed the toddler in the faded photograph they'd kept on their mantel for decades. Jeffrey stared at the image, tears streaming down his weathered face. "That's her," he whispered. "That's our Melissa." Lisa began drafting a careful message to send through social media. "We need to approach this gently," she cautioned. "For Melanie, for Melissa, this will be earth-shattering news." Alta nodded, clutching Jeffrey's hand. "After 51 years," she said, "we can be patient a little longer." The message was sent that evening, launching into the digital void like a prayer. A modern miracle born from science, persistence, and a family's refusal to give up hope. Lisa Jo Sheely stared at her computer screen, carefully crafting each word of the message. This wasn't just another genealogy inquiry. This could change lives forever. After triple-checking her research, she took a deep breath and clicked send on a Facebook message to Melanie Walden, the woman she believed was actually Melissa Highsmith. "I've found something important regarding your biological family that you should know," the message began, explaining the DNA connection without overwhelming details. Lisa Jo included her contact information and a gentle explanation of the Highsmith family's decades-long search. The message sat unread in Melanie's inbox for days. When the notification finally appeared, Melanie almost scrolled past it, assuming it was spam. But something about the subject line made her pause. As she read the carefully worded message, her hands began to tremble. The stranger's words suggested her entire life was built on falsehood. "This can't be real," she whispered to herself, closing the laptop without responding. The seed of doubt had been planted, however, and sleep evaded her that night as memories of her strict, secretive childhood resurfaced. The lack of family photos, the constant moving, her mother's evasiveness about the past. Meanwhile, Chris, Melanie's husband of 15 years, noticed his wife's distraction. When she finally shared Lisa Jo's message, his curiosity led him to search online. He discovered the Finding Melissa Highsmith Facebook page, created by the siblings of a toddler who vanished in Fort Worth in 1971. "Melanie, you need to see this," he said one evening, calling her to his computer. The resemblance between her childhood photos and the age progression images on the page was striking. Even more compelling were the family stories, the Highsmiths' traditions and mannerisms that somehow matched Melanie's own inexplicable habits. "Look at her smile," Chris pointed to a photo of Alta Highsmith. "It's identical to yours and to our daughters." Melanie stood frozen, staring at the strangers who might be her blood relatives. The possibility was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Could these people explain the emptiness she'd felt her entire life? "What if it's true?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible. "What does that make me? Who am I if I'm not Melanie Walden?" Chris wrapped his arms around her shoulders. "You're still you, but maybe there's more to your story than we knew." That night, Melanie drafted and deleted a dozen responses to Lisa Jo. The truth beckoned, but it also threatened everything she understood about herself. With trembling fingers, she finally typed a simple reply. "I'm listening. Tell me more." Melanie Walden sat at her kitchen table at 3 in the morning, surrounded by a small collection of papers that supposedly documented her life. Her fingers trembled as she sifted through the meager evidence of her existence. School records with inconsistent information, a suspicious lack of baby photos, and a birth certificate that had always seemed off somehow. "This can't be real," she whispered, running her hand through her disheveled hair. The message from the Finding Melissa Highsmith page kept replaying in her mind. Chris had been the one to really see it, comparing her childhood photo with the images online, while she'd been too afraid to look closely. "The eyes are identical," he had said gently, placing his hand over hers. "And that birthmark on your wrist, it's in the baby pictures too." All those strange childhood moments suddenly made terrible sense. Her mother's refusal to discuss family history, the strict isolation from neighbors, the way she'd panic if Melanie wandered too far at the grocery store. The woman who raised her had always claimed it was for protection, but now Melanie understood it was fear of discovery. She recalled asking about her father once when she was 9. The question had triggered such rage that she never dared mention it again. "Some questions are better left unasked," her mother had hissed, eyes darting toward the locked drawer where she kept important documents. After 3 sleepless nights, Melanie finally agreed to the DNA test. Chris drove her to the clinic, holding her hand throughout the simple cheek swab procedure. The technician had smiled reassuringly, unaware of the life-altering implications of this routine test. 2 weeks later, the results arrived via email. Melanie stared at her device, the clinical language swimming before her eyes. 99.9998% probability of parent-child relationship with Jeffrey Highsmith and Alta Highsmith. She was Melissa Highsmith, the missing toddler, the child who vanished 51 years ago. The revelation hit her with physical force, leaving her breathless and disoriented. She was both Melanie and Melissa, a woman with 2 identities, neither of which felt fully real. Anger surged through her veins, at the woman who stole her, at the universe for this cruel joke, even at her biological parents for being strangers. Yet beneath the anger lay something unexpected: relief. The persistent feeling of displacement that had shadowed her entire life finally made sense. She wasn't crazy for feeling like an outsider in her own story. "What do I do now?" she asked Chris, who sat beside her, equally stunned by the confirmation. "Whatever you want," he answered, squeezing her hand. "But you don't have to decide everything tonight." Melissa nodded, the name still foreign on her tongue. She was 53 years old, discovering her life's first chapter for the first time. The truth had found her, but understanding it would take much longer. For 3 days, Melissa Walden stared at her phone, the notification from the Finding Melissa Highsmith page glowing accusingly each time she unlocked the screen. Her entire identity hung in the balance of a simple reply. "Mom, you need to talk to them," her eldest daughter insisted one evening, gently placing a cup of tea beside her. "We want to know where we come from, too." The DNA results had sent shockwaves through their household. Chris had been the first to truly believe, spending hours comparing her childhood photos with those on the Highsmith's page. The resemblance was undeniable: the same crinkle around the eyes when smiling, the distinctive arch of eyebrows. "What if they're disappointed?" Melissa whispered, voicing her deepest fear. 51 years of waiting for someone who doesn't match their expectations. Her children gathered around the kitchen table, offering silent support as she finally dialed the number Lisa Jo had provided. Her trembling finger hovered over the call button for several heartbeats before pressing down. The phone rang 3 times. Then a woman's voice, older, wavering with emotion, answered. "Hello?" Alta Highsmith said, the single word carrying 5 decades of hope. Melissa couldn't speak. Her throat constricted as tears welled up. Is this our Melissa?" Jeffrey's voice joined in, apparently on speakerphone. "Yes," she managed finally. "I think I am." What followed was a conversation unlike any other, halting, emotional, punctuated by long silences and sudden sobs. Alta described the apartment where Melissa had lived as a toddler. Jeffrey recounted how he'd kept her baby shoes in his dresser drawer all these years. "We never stopped looking," Alta said, her Texas accent thick with emotion. "Not for one single day." "We don't expect anything," Jeffrey added quickly. "We just want to know you're okay, to know you've been loved." Melissa listened, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed their words. These strangers who were her family spoke of unconditional love, of Thanksgiving dinners with an empty chair, of prayers said every night for 51 years. "I have children," she told them softly. 3. They want to meet you." The sharp intake of breath on the other end told her everything. She had given them grandchildren they never knew existed. "We have so much time to make up for," Alta whispered. "But there's no rush. We'll take it as slow as you need." As the call ended, Melissa sat in silence, her husband's arm around her shoulders. Something had shifted, not healed, not yet. But a door long sealed shut had finally creaked open. The crisp November air carried the scent of roasting turkey and cornbread stuffing through Alta Highsmith's modest Fort Worth home. For 51 Thanksgivings, she had set an extra place at the table, a ritual of hope that had sustained her through decades of heartache. Today, that empty chair would finally be filled. Jeffrey paced nervously by the window, checking his watch every few minutes. "Do you think she'll actually come?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alta smoothed the tablecloth for the 20th time. "She promised, Jeffrey. Our baby is coming home." The Highsmith siblings gathered in the living room, their own children watching curiously as the adults struggled to maintain composure. The doorbell's chime sent a jolt through the house. Jeffrey froze, then moved toward the door with trembling hands. Melissa Highsmith stood on the porch, her husband Chris supportive at her side. For a moment, no one moved. Then Alta stepped forward, her eyes drinking in the face of the daughter she'd last seen as a toddler. "You have my mother's eyes," Alta whispered, reaching out tentatively. Melissa nodded, unable to speak. The threshold between them seemed impossibly wide, 51 years of absence compressed into a single step. When she finally entered, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Time seemed to collapse around them. Alta reached for a worn envelope on the mantel, extracting the only baby photo she had kept all these years. "This is you," she said, pressing it into Melissa's hands. "This is the baby I've been looking for." Melissa traced the edges of the yellowed photograph. "I never knew," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I always felt something was missing." The room filled with quiet weeping. Jeffrey stood back, overwhelmed by both joy and sorrow, until Melissa looked up at him. Their eyes met, and he crossed the room in 3 strides to embrace his daughter. "I'm sorry," he said, his shoulders shaking. "I'm so sorry we couldn't find you." The Thanksgiving meal waited as the family gathered in the living room. Melissa's siblings approached one by one, each connection a small miracle of its own. They shared stories, pointing out family resemblances that Melissa had never recognized in herself. Chris watched his wife navigate this new reality, squeezing her hand when emotions threatened to overwhelm her. "Your mother set this place for you every year," he told her, gesturing toward the table. "She never gave up." When they finally sat down to eat, Alta said grace, her voice steady despite her tears. "Thank you for bringing our daughter home," she prayed, "and for the gift of second chances." Melissa looked around at these strangers who were her blood, this home that might have been hers, and felt the first tentative stirrings of belonging. The weight of both joy and sorrow hung in the air, too complex for words, too profound for anything but gratitude. The Thanksgiving reunion that had begun with tears of joy soon revealed the complicated reality beneath the surface. Halfway through dinner, Melissa Highsmith pushed back from the table, her hands trembling as she excused herself. In the hallway bathroom, she pressed her palms against the cool tile, fighting waves of conflicting emotions that threatened to drown her. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be," she whispered to her reflection. Outside, her biological family waited, strangers who shared her blood yet knew nothing of her life. When Chris gently knocked on the door, she allowed him in. Her husband had been her rock through this impossible transition, understanding her need to process this upheaval at her own pace. "They've waited 51 years, he reminded her. "They'll wait a little longer if you need time." Meanwhile, in the living room, Alta clutched Jeffrey's hand as they exchanged worried glances. The mother who had kept a place setting for her missing daughter at every holiday for decades now feared she might lose Melissa all over again. When Melissa finally returned to the gathering, her siblings created a protective circle around her. They had grown up in the shadow of her absence, their identities formed around being the missing girl's brothers and sisters. Now they found themselves unsure how to relate to the actual woman, rather than the ghost who had haunted their family home. "We used to make up stories about where you might be," her younger sister admitted, passing a faded photo album across the coffee table. "Sometimes we imagined you were a princess or an astronaut." The reality that Melissa had lived just minutes away in North Fort Worth, raised by a controlling woman under false pretenses, was both miraculous and heartbreaking. As afternoon faded into evening, Melissa's 3 children bonded with their newfound relatives, pointing out shared mannerisms and features. Her oldest daughter discovered she had her grandmother's laugh, while her son realized he had inherited the same distinctive eyebrow arch as his uncle. "It's like finding puzzle pieces I never knew were missing," her daughter remarked, studying family photos on the wall. For Melissa, these connections were both comforting and disorienting. Every shared trait was evidence of what had been stolen from her. 5 decades of family birthdays, graduations, and ordinary Sundays that could never be recovered. As the evening drew to a close, Jeffrey raised his glass in a toast. "To finding what was lost," he said, his voice breaking slightly. Melissa nodded, managing a small smile. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was the beginning of a long, complicated journey of rebuilding what had been broken so many years ago in the Texas heat. The weight of 51 years pressed down on Melissa as she parked her car outside the modest house with lace curtains that had been her prison and sanctuary. 3 weeks after the Thanksgiving reunion with the Highsmiths, she finally gathered the courage to confront the woman who had raised her as Melanie. Her hands trembled as she knocked on the familiar door. The scent of lavender lotion hit her immediately when it opened, revealing an elderly woman whose eyes widened with a mixture of defiance and fear. "I knew you'd come back," the woman said, her voice smaller than Melissa remembered. The living room remained unchanged, the same faded floral couch, the outdated television set, the religious figurines collecting dust on shelves. Melissa had rehearsed 1,000 angry speeches, but sitting across from her kidnapper, words failed her. "Why?" she finally managed. "Why did you take me?" The woman's hands fidgeted with her cardigan buttons. "I never took you. I bought you," she replied matter-of-factly. "From a woman who said she couldn't keep you. I paid $800. All my savings back then." Melissa felt her chest tighten. "You bought me? Like property?" "I meant well," the elderly woman insisted, tears forming. "I wanted a child so badly. The woman said she was babysitting you and your mother didn't want you anymore. I believed her." The absurdity of the explanation made Melissa's head spin. Alta Highsmith had set a place at Thanksgiving for 51 years, praying for her return, while this woman convinced herself she was performing an act of charity. "Why the isolation, the homeschooling, never letting me have friends?" Melissa pressed, her voice rising. Her kidnapper looked away. "I was afraid someone would recognize you. Then after a few years it was easier to keep things as they were." When Melissa showed her the newspaper clippings about her disappearance, the woman claimed she never saw them, that she didn't read the papers much back then. Each vague answer only spawned more questions. "Were there others?" Melissa asked, remembering the siblings she never knew she had. The woman's silence spoke volumes. As Melissa rose to leave, her former mother grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "I gave you a good life," she insisted. "I loved you like my own." Melissa gently removed the woman's hand. Love doesn't steal children from their families. Driving away, Melissa called Chris, her husband's steady voice anchoring her as tears blurred the road ahead. She had hoped for answers, for some grand revelation that would make sense of her fractured life. Instead, she left with only the hollow justifications of a woman who had stolen her identity along with her childhood. The truth, it seemed, would remain as elusive as Melissa herself had been for 51 years. As the Highsmith family's reunion became public knowledge, Fort Worth authorities reopened the decades-old case. Detective Sergeant Marcus Reynolds, who specialized in cold cases, found himself staring at yellowed files and microfiche records that had gathered dust since the Nixon administration. The statute of limitations for kidnapping expired years ago, he explained to Jeffrey and Alta Highsmith during a meeting at the police headquarters. "But we're looking at fraud, forgery, and identity theft charges that might still apply." The investigation revealed a deliberate pattern of deception. There was no record of legal adoption, no court proceedings, just a paper trail that had been meticulously obscured. Melissa sat quietly as the detective explained how her abductor had managed to raise her without raising suspicions from authorities. "She kept moving us," Melissa recalled later that evening, sitting at her parents' kitchen table. "Every few years, different neighborhood, different school district. Now I understand why." The most shocking discovery came when Melissa requested her birth records from the state of Texas. What arrived was not her original certificate, but a document created 7 years after her disappearance, listing her abductor as her biological mother. The forgery was sophisticated enough to pass casual inspection but contained discrepancies that would have been obvious to anyone comparing it with genuine records. "They effectively erased me," Melissa whispered, her fingers tracing the falsified names. This piece of paper is why no one could find me for 51 years. Alta reached across the table, her weathered hand covering her daughter's. But they couldn't erase the DNA, could they? The bureaucratic labyrinth extended beyond birth certificates. School records had been minimal due to homeschooling. Medical visits were rare and paid in cash. Social security numbers had been obtained through fraudulent documentation. Each revelation was another wound for Melissa, another betrayal to process. Chris, Melissa's husband, became her advocate, spending hours on the phone with government agencies trying to restore her legal identity. "It's like she's been living as a ghost," he told Jeffrey during a rare moment alone, "existing but not officially recognized as who she truly is." For the Highsmith siblings, the legal complications triggered a mix of rage and renewed purpose. They started documenting everything, creating a detailed timeline of the abduction and subsequent cover-up. Their dining room transformed into an investigation headquarters, with timelines taped to walls and folders stacked in careful chronology. "This isn't just about our family anymore," Melissa's younger sister explained to a local reporter. "How many other children are out there, living lives built on lies, whose families are still searching? The system failed us for half a century. We won't let it fail anyone else." The weight of 51 years pressed down on Melissa Highsmith's shoulders as she sat in the small, sunlit office of Dr. Mary Ann Wells, a trauma specialist in downtown Fort Worth. 3 sessions in, and she still struggled to articulate the storm inside her. The therapist's gentle questions peeled back layers of confusion that had accumulated over decades. "I feel like I'm betraying her," Melissa whispered, twisting a tissue between her fingers. "She raised me, but then I think about Alta, my real mother, setting that place at the table every year, and I feel guilty for not finding them sooner." Dr. Wells nodded, understanding the complex loyalty trap Melissa found herself in. The woman who had taken her as a toddler had shaped her entire world, controlled her narrative, and even now, Melissa caught herself defending her abductor. "Your feelings are valid," the therapist assured her. "You're mourning 2 lives simultaneously, the one you lived and the one that was taken from you." These weekly sessions became Melissa's anchor as she navigated the choppy waters of her new reality. She worked through panic attacks that struck when reporters ambushed her outside her home. She processed the rage that sometimes erupted when Jeffrey mentioned how close they had lived to each other all those years, just minutes away, strangers in the same city. Dr. Wells suggested practical steps toward healing. "Build new connections through shared experiences," she advised. "Not grand gestures, but small, consistent moments." Melissa started with Alta, spending Thursday afternoons in her mother's kitchen. At first, they moved awkwardly around each other, but gradually the rhythm of measuring flour and rolling dough created a wordless language between them. Alta taught her to make cornbread from a recipe passed down through generations, the heritage Melissa should have learned as a child. With Jeffrey, it was fishing at Lake Worth. They would sit for hours, sometimes talking, often silent, watching their lines cut through the water's surface. One afternoon, as they packed up their gear, her father hesitantly placed his hand on her shoulder. "I never stopped looking for you," he said, his voice breaking, "not for one day." Melissa nodded, unable to speak, but allowing herself to lean into his touch. Her children embraced these new grandparents with surprising ease, creating bridges where Melissa still struggled to cross. They collected family stories, compared genetic traits, and filled photo albums with new memories alongside the few precious old ones. In therapy, Melissa learned to recognize progress in small victories. The first time she called Alta Mom without feeling like an imposter. The night she slept without nightmares. The morning she looked in the mirror and recognized her own face as part of a larger family story. Healing isn't linear, Dr. Wells reminded her. You're allowed to feel everything. The anger, the joy, the confusion. All of it belongs in your story. The Highsmith siblings had lived most of their lives in the shadow of absence. Now, with Melissa's miraculous return, that shadow transformed into a beacon of hope. What began as informal gatherings in church basements evolved into the Texas Missing Persons Network, a grassroots organization headquartered in the community rooms of Tarrant County libraries. "We spent 51 years searching for one person," said Victoria Highsmith, Melissa's younger sister, during their first official meeting. "Imagine what we can accomplish, searching for hundreds together." The siblings divided responsibilities according to their strengths. Victoria managed social media outreach, while her brother Michael coordinated with local law enforcement. Their youngest sister, Sharon, organized support sessions for families still waiting for answers. Each of them carried the weight of those lost years, channeling their pain into purpose. Detective Ramon Gutierrez from the Fort Worth Police Department became a regular attendee, offering insights on how families could preserve evidence and maintain case visibility. "What the Highsmiths accomplished wasn't luck," he told the growing crowd at the Central Library meeting. "It was persistence and embracing new technology when traditional methods failed." The Finding Melissa Highsmith Facebook page, once a digital shrine to their missing sister, transformed into a national platform. Families from Oklahoma, Louisiana, and as far as Oregon began sharing their stories, uploading DNA profiles, and supporting each other through the grueling process of searching. Lisa Jo Sheely, the genealogist who had helped crack Melissa's case, volunteered her expertise every Saturday, guiding families through the complexities of ancestry databases and genetic matching. Her dining room table became command central, covered with laptops and family trees, as she worked tirelessly to connect more missing pieces. "The hardest part isn't the technical stuff," Lisa Jo explained to a mother who had been searching for her son for 12 years. "It's maintaining hope through the silence." The Highsmiths showed us that silence doesn't mean the end. For Melissa, watching her siblings transform their trauma into community action brought complicated emotions. She attended meetings when she could, though sometimes the weight of so many missing faces on the walls overwhelmed her. During those moments, Jeffrey would quietly lead his daughter outside, both of them taking deep breaths under the Texas sky. "You don't have to be the symbol," he assured her. "You've done enough by coming home." But for many families who gathered in those library meeting rooms, Melissa's very existence was proof that miracles could happen, that DNA could bridge gaps that decades of searching couldn't close. Her siblings understood this power, carefully balancing privacy with purpose as their network expanded across state lines. By summer's end, 4 more families had submitted DNA samples, and 2 had received preliminary matches that warranted further investigation. The Highsmiths' perseverance had become a roadmap for others lost in decades-old mysteries, proving that even the coldest cases could thaw with the right combination of science, community, and unwavering faith. The story of Melissa Highsmith's miraculous return after 51 years exploded across news outlets overnight. By dawn, a cavalcade of television vans lined the quiet Fort Worth street where the Highsmith family home stood. Reporters clutched microphones and coffee cups, jostling for position on the lawn that had just days before been a place of private celebration. Jeffrey Highsmith opened his front door to find cameras trained on his face. The soft-spoken father, who had spent decades clipping articles about missing children, now found himself the subject of headlines. Local stations interrupted regular programming with breaking news banners, while national networks dispatched correspondents to Texas with alarming speed. "This is a story of hope," one anchor declared, standing beneath the scorching sun. "A DNA miracle that proves we should never give up." Some journalists approached with genuine compassion. They sat respectfully in Alta's living room, allowing the mother to share her half-century vigil in her own words. These stories captured the essence of the family's journey: the Thanksgiving place settings, the candles in windows, the unwavering faith that had sustained them. Others proved less delicate. Tabloids speculated wildly about Melissa's life with the woman who had taken her. Photographers with telephoto lenses captured Melissa collecting her mail or walking to her vehicle. One particularly aggressive reporter cornered one of her children outside a grocery store, demanding details about their grandmother, the woman who had stolen Melissa as a toddler. "They're treating us like characters in some crime show," Melissa confided to Chris one evening, drawing the curtains against the flashing lights outside. "I just found my family. I'm not ready to belong to everyone else." The media attention took its toll. Melissa stopped answering her phone and retreated to her bedroom when visitors arrived. The woman who had spent a lifetime adapting to secrets now found herself exposed to millions of strangers who believed they knew her story. Her siblings formed a protective circle. They screened calls, issued brief statements, and took turns staying at her house. Jeffrey installed privacy screens on the windows, while Alta fielded interview requests with increasing firmness. "My daughter needs time," she told a persistent journalist. "We've waited 51 years. The world can wait a few months more." Local churches rallied around the family. Members of First Baptist and St. Andrew's Methodist formed human chains when necessary, allowing the Highsmiths brief moments of normalcy, a dinner out, a quiet walk. Fort Worth itself became divided between those who respected the family's privacy and those who sought proximity to the unfolding drama. Yet beneath the chaos, something profound was happening. Other families of missing children began to hope again, watching the Highsmiths' story with renewed determination to find their own answers. As the media attention surrounding Melissa Highsmith's miraculous return began to settle, a new challenge emerged within the family's Fort Worth home. Alta Highsmith, whose unwavering faith had sustained her through 51 years of waiting, started showing signs of cognitive decline. Her memory, once filled with vivid details of her toddler's last day, began to fragment in unpredictable ways. "Melissa, sweetheart, did you finish your breakfast? You need to eat before nap time," Alta would say, momentarily trapped in 1971, speaking to her 53-year-old daughter as if she were still a toddler. These episodes left Melissa frozen, unsure whether to correct her mother or play along with the temporal confusion. Jeffrey noticed the changes first, observing how his wife would sometimes stare at their daughter with a mixture of recognition and bewilderment. "The doctor says it's the stress of everything," he confided to Chris during a quiet moment on the porch. "All those years of grief, then sudden joy, it's been too much for her mind to process." The realization that time was now working against them created a new urgency. Melissa began visiting her parents' home 3 times weekly, bringing photo albums and mementos from her own life to share. These afternoon sessions became sacred rituals, Alta sitting in her favorite armchair, Melissa beside her on the worn sofa, bridging decades of separation through stories and gentle touch. "Tell me again about my first steps," Melissa would prompt, watching her mother's eyes light up with clarity as she described how her baby girl had toddled across their small apartment kitchen, arms outstretched and laughing. They established new traditions, too. Every Wednesday, they baked together using Alta's handwritten recipes. The familiar motions of measuring flour and cracking eggs seemed to anchor Alta in the present, her hands remembering what her mind sometimes forgot. During one such afternoon, while making snickerdoodle cookies, Alta suddenly grabbed Melissa's wrist. "I never stopped looking for you," she said with startling lucidity. "Every birthday, I'd light a candle and pray you were safe, wherever you were." Melissa's siblings joined these gatherings when possible, filling the house with laughter and creating new memories to replace the decades of absence. They recorded conversations on their smartphones, precious archives of Alta's clearer moments, insurance against the day when her memories might fade completely. For Melissa, these bittersweet afternoons became both gift and burden, the chance to know her mother tempered by the knowledge that they were racing against time. Yet, in Alta's intermittent confusion, there was also a strange comfort. In those moments when past and present blurred, mother and daughter existed together in a timeless space where separation had never occurred. As Melissa Highsmith's story spread across Fort Worth, her eldest daughter, Sarah, became increasingly fascinated with her mother's mysterious past. One rainy afternoon, Sarah rummaged through dusty cardboard boxes stored in their garage, containers that had followed Melissa through multiple moves without ever being properly unpacked. Behind faded photo albums and childhood memorabilia, Sarah discovered a yellowed envelope. Inside was a birth certificate for Melanie Walden, dated 3 years after Melissa's actual birth. The document looked official at first glance, but upon closer inspection, Sarah noticed inconsistencies in the paper quality and printing. "Mom," she called, her voice trembling. "I think I found something important." Melissa sat at her kitchen table, hands shaking as she examined the forged document. For 51 years, this piece of paper had been her official identity, a fabrication that had kept her from her true family. Running her fingers over the faded ink, she felt a strange connection to her past self, the toddler who had been erased and recreated on this counterfeit form. "This is the first real evidence I have," she whispered to Sarah. "Something I can actually touch that proves what happened to me." Meanwhile, the reopened investigation took an unexpected turn when Elaine Martinez, who had lived next door to Melissa's abductor in the mid-70s, contacted the authorities. The elderly woman had been watching a news segment about the Highsmith reunion when memories came flooding back. "There was another little girl for about 8 months," Elaine told Detective Wilson at the Fort Worth Police Department. "Dark-haired, maybe 3 years old. That woman claimed she was her niece, but one day the child just disappeared. When I asked about her, she said the girl had gone back to her parents in Oklahoma." The detective made careful notes, comparing timelines. "And you never saw this child again?" Elaine shook her head. "I always felt something wasn't right, but back then, people minded their own business more." When Jeffrey and Alta Highsmith learned about this potential second victim, their hearts broke anew. Alta clutched her husband's hand during their meeting with investigators at the police station. "All these years we thought our tragedy was isolated," Jeffrey said, his voice heavy with emotion. "To think there might be another family out there, still waiting and wondering." The police expanded their investigation, searching decades-old records for missing children reports that matched the time frame and description. Cold case detectives from neighboring counties joined the effort, combing through archives and interviewing former residents of the neighborhood. For Melissa, this revelation brought complicated emotions: horror at the thought of another stolen child, yet validation that her own experience was part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior. The birth certificate in her hands was no longer just her story, but potentially a piece of evidence in a much darker mystery that was only beginning to unfold. The Highsmith story spread across Texas like wildfire, igniting a movement that transcended their personal journey. Within months of Melissa's reunion, dozens of families with decades-old missing persons cases contacted Jeffrey and Alta, desperate to replicate their miracle. The family's Facebook page, once dedicated solely to finding Melissa Highsmith, transformed into a hub for cold case advocacy. Churches throughout Fort Worth opened their doors for what locals began calling hope drives. At St. Andrew's Methodist Church, where the Highsmith siblings had once gathered in grief, now stood tables with DNA kits and volunteers helping families navigate the complex world of genetic genealogy. The movement expanded to community centers across Tarrant County, where photographs of missing loved ones lined the walls. Lisa Jo Sheely found herself at the center of this groundswell. The genealogist who had helped bring Melissa home now volunteered 20 hours weekly, guiding families through the process she had pioneered with the Highsmiths. "Every family deserves answers," she told a local reporter. "Technology has finally caught up with our hope." Alta, despite her failing memory, became the emotional heart of these gatherings. She moved slowly between tables, squeezing hands and sharing her story. 51 years, she would whisper. Never stop believing. Melissa herself approached these events with complicated emotions. While she avoided cameras and refused interviews, she worked quietly behind the scenes, helping families craft social media campaigns that would reach the widest audience. Her children joined the effort too, particularly her eldest daughter, who developed a knack for navigating ancestry databases. The ripple effect spread beyond Texas. Law enforcement agencies from neighboring states sent representatives to Fort Worth to study what locals had dubbed the Highsmith method, the combination of DNA testing, social media outreach, and community involvement that had solved the seemingly unsolvable case. 4 months after Melissa's return, the movement celebrated its first success. A 63-year-old man from Houston discovered through DNA matching that he was actually Tommy Jenkins, who had disappeared from his backyard in Dallas in 1961. His case had gone cold within weeks, but the genetic breadcrumbs finally led him home. When Tommy reunited with his elderly sister, his only surviving family member, Melissa was there, standing quietly in the background. She watched as decades of uncertainty dissolved in a single embrace, knowing that her own journey had helped make this moment possible. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something powerful enough to heal others. 1 year after the reunion that shook Fort Worth to its core, Melissa Highsmith stood in the living room of her childhood home, a place both foreign and familiar. The afternoon light filtered through curtains she never knew as a child, casting gentle shadows across the faces of the family she had spent 51 years separated from. Alta Highsmith, now struggling with occasional memory lapses, reached for her daughter's hand with the tenderness only a mother could possess. "I never changed your room," Alta whispered, leading Melissa down the hallway to a small bedroom preserved like a time capsule. The walls were painted a soft yellow, adorned with fading photographs and childish drawings. A timeline of absence transformed into presence. Jeffrey Highsmith watched from the doorway, his weathered face a map of decades spent searching. The guilt that once consumed him had softened into something quieter, a gentle reminder of resilience rather than failure. He had spent most of his life clipping articles about missing children, and now his daughter stood before him. No longer a statistic or a cold case. "The neighbors thought we were crazy," he said, gesturing to the boxes of newspaper clippings stacked in the corner. "But we knew you were out there somewhere." Melissa's siblings arrived one by one, bringing dishes for dinner and children eager to know their aunt. The house filled with laughter, the kind that only comes after tears have been exhausted. Her brother brought photo albums, while her sister carried handmade gifts, tokens of welcome from a family determined to make up for lost time. Chris, Melissa's husband, observed the scene with quiet amazement. He had stood by her through the DNA test, the shocking revelations, and the painful confrontation with the woman who had raised her under false pretenses. Now he watched as his wife found her footing in this new reality, her identity no longer fragmented but whole. As evening descended, the family gathered on the porch. Jeffrey retrieved a simple white candle from a drawer, the same type Alta had placed in the window every night for years. "This was our signal to you," he explained, his voice breaking slightly, "so you could find your way home if you were lost." He struck a match and lit the wick, placing the candle on the windowsill. The flame danced, casting a warm glow across Melissa's face. "I'm not lost anymore," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. The candle that once represented absence now celebrated presence. Outside, other homes in the neighborhood had begun lighting their own candles, a community movement inspired by the Highsmith story. Across Texas, other families with missing loved ones kept their own flames burning, hope rekindled by the knowledge that sometimes, even after 51 years, love finds its way home.